So thank you very much for your kind invitation to Ernst, to Joachim. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here with you. Since I guess I'm the business school professor, I couldn't resist the temptation of having some slides to try to give an overview. So I will structure my intervention here, if you like, in two pillars. One, I come from a political family, so I will try to give a political overview of the trends since the end of World War II. And then in the second part of my intervention, I will try to give an overview of what we know coming from the economics profession, from my discipline, which has many flaws. I'll discuss briefly those flaws, but also some nice aspects. So then, hopefully, this will allow you to combine the two and see where we stand. So if we were to think, if you like, about how we ended up here, I think we need to realize the following. So after World War II, the world experienced a remarkable period of the 50s and the 60s that saw reconstruction and very robust growth. And here I refer to what Joachim mentioned as first war issues. Now, at that time, the political spectrum was in the traditional, if you like, left-right type of distinction. There were some center-left, center-right parties, perhaps a communist party or parties in the radical left or the far right. And if I was to look at the political equilibrium, it was something like a liberal system in the sense that, this country, Germany, the United Kingdom, the US, had like capitalist systems. But if you were to go under the surface, those capitalist systems were characterized by very high levels of taxation, very strict regulation, a lot of industrial type of policies. So it was a hybrid system. It was clearly non-communist capitalist system, but with a lot of intervention. Now, what is further interesting about this period is, like economic history, is that if we measure things properly, this is the period in world history with the lowest recorded levels of inequality. I refer to the US here or the United Kingdom. Now, we go to the 70s, and this system experiences its first cracks. This is a period of high inflation, coined at the same time with high levels of unemployment. There is a slowdown of growth. The Bretton Woods system of the international financial architecture is under attack. We have some social unrest. We have some radicalization. But then those individuals come with a revolution. And actually, drawing on insights from my discipline, from economics, they suggest that, the blame has to go to the unions, it has to go to organized labor. If we free markets, if we privatize, if we liberalize, then this period of high inflation and high unemployment will go away. And they have been extremely influential. I would say there are good elements of their policies, some perhaps not so good elements of those policies. What I found very interesting is that if you were to go in the 80s at the other side of the Iron Curtain, so those two individuals, Deng Xiaoping and Michael Gorbachev, clearly you wouldn't put them in the same league as those, but they are trying to open up their economies. Clearly opening up means something very different in China and in the Soviet Union at the time, but if I'm not mistaken, Glasnost means opening up, so there were elements of opening up the economies. Moreover, this paradigm of more openness and more trade integration, to say the least, is also exported in emerging markets, in, if you like, second world, through the new Washington Consensus. So we have this element now of coming mostly from the traditional right at the time, that we should free up markets, we should embrace competition, we should trust the markets, if you like, more, bring down taxation, privatize, and things will improve. And what I think is very interesting is that then those individuals, what we coin as the new left, here Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, effectively embraced a lot of the ideas that were coming from those neoliberal revolution, coming from the left, so without necessarily jeopardizing the welfare state or, without much hurting the rights of unions and organized labor. And effectively, we have this ideological convergence, which I think is symbolized or epitomized by the big coalition in Germany, where we have the SPD and the CDU running the government together. So from a political competition standpoint, this is very interesting because we have this considerable convergence of policies, of politicians with very diverse initial backgrounds, but over time convergence, if you like, to a modus operandi. So what are the trends before crisis? We have robust growth, actually to some extent driven by automation, by globalization. Globalization brings huge benefits in China, in Asia, in parts of the world outside the European Union, if you like, Switzerland or the US. At the same time, we have technology and automation, and this trend continues as time evolves. But if you were to look deeper, you realize the following issues. First, this period of low inequality stops, and we see a remarkable reversal, and this is very clear in the data of Saez and Piketty in the US and other parts of the world, sometimes in the early 80s. So now we have in the 80s growth, but now, and in most of those growth gains come to a smaller and increasingly smaller part of the population. And then we have this very interesting work from Raj Chetty and Nate Hendren and various other co-authors pointing out that social mobility has been declining again with a big trend starting, roughly speaking, in the early to mid-80s. So growth, but if you were to look beyond means or medians, there seems to be some interesting action happening. Now, issues that we didn't pay that much attention at the time, and let me start with those, is that who exactly now represents labor? And this is an interesting question because, as very exciting research, among others, by David Dorn has shown, the traditional type of labor in the United Kingdom or the US seems to be disappearing as the global production is shifting to Vietnam, to China, and perhaps other parts of the developing world. Well, how do we think, so that's a second question, there's a very big critique, I think, to the discipline of economists here. How do we think about trade more generally? We have very elaborate models in trade about the aggregate benefits of trade. I think if David was to run his nice questionnaire about the benefits of trade among economists, you would get something like 98% of economists agreeing on the benefits of trade. We have very good empirical and theoretical arguments why this is the case. But typically, if you go to a trade economic seminar, they will conclude with some slide on redistribution, but then they will say, oh, the public finance guys, have to deal with those issues. So another issue that we didn't pay much attention at the time is that there has been, so this period of growth in the US and the Western world in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s actually was accompanied by a significant increase in labor force participation. So we had the African American population joining in, women joining in the labor force, which of course helped bring down inequality. But this trend started to reversal, at least in the US, that we have good data, sometimes in the early 2000s. At the time, nobody paid much attention. And this brings us to the crisis. And the crisis was a very big shock, and I think the world was very lucky to have Ben Bernanke leading this effort to prevent a Great Depression. And interestingly, the policies that we focused during the crisis was monetary policy, was fiscal policy. Barry Eichengreen at the time was writing very important pieces saying that we should prevent a reversal of protectionism, and I think to a first approximation, the world prevented this mistake that happened during the Great Depression. But on the deeper issues, there was not much intervention. So for example, I urge you to have a look at this very new book by Thomas Philippon, who makes the point that, if you look at product markets, nothing major happened, and we see rising concentration, especially in the US. So these underlying trends continued being there. So there were some successes, clearly, on the policy response after the crisis, but there was actually the focus of policy, and if you go to a macro seminar, you realize this immediately, it was the effort to have a recovery of the aggregate economic activity, how the average person will do better. But in a word, the average is a good, if you like, moment, as long as the distribution is not very diverse. And we have very fascinating work saying that even the recovery in the US was mostly an issue that was coming to the top 1 or perhaps the top 0.1 of the income distribution. So, what does this tell us about populism? So, actually, Barry and Thorsten before that gave some definitions about populism, but I want to echo what Matt mentioned earlier, that populists, or what we blend as populists, are very heterogeneous. across the world. So I come from a country that actually first elected a populist, perhaps a prime minister, but he was coming from the left and was very different from the faces of populism that you see here, Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, and Viktor Orban. So clearly there are, in here actually I also adopt the definition by Norris and Engelhardt. So there are common elements of populism, but there is a lot of heterogeneity, which of course, given the big heterogeneity, the findings that were summarized by the earlier intervention are not that surprising. Different features are at play because populism takes very different phases, if you like. Now, what do we know, I think, from research? And let me try to just give you a tick list of what I think we know. So let me start with economics. Actually, economists, perhaps not surprisingly, are really good at measuring economic type of shocks and try to measure their implications. So since I'm drafting with Sergei Guriev a review for the Journal of Economic Literature and we are reading over the literature, let me convey what we think we know decently well and what we don't know very well. So I think the first element that we know quite well is that short-run and medium-run economic shocks and insecurity have contributed in the recent period in the rise of populism. There is fantastic work by David Dorn, David Otter, and Gordon Hanson, initially in the US, showing that the so-called China shock that moved production from the US, mostly from the Rust Belt and the manufacturing towns, to China, Mexico to some extent, and also to Vietnam and other countries, had a profound impact on US labor markets. The next step of this research showed that those areas in rural Wisconsin, in rural, perhaps Ohio and Pennsylvania, moved to more radicalization. They have a very interesting paper showing increased polarization, but also increased voting for Trump and populists. And what is interesting is that this research has been applied in many other settings, including, for example, voting for Brexit and UKIP, and there seems a similar pattern across many different settings. So trade globalization affected rich industrial countries, and populists found a lot of fertile, if you like, soil to convey their message in those areas. There is a second related strand of work. Luigi Guizzo has contributed a lot here. We have a paper with Jan Algan and Sergei Guriev and Evgenia Passari at Brookings, showing that even the short-run effects of the crisis quickly translated into an increasing share of voting for the populist parties. Third, related again to economics, the paper that Thorsten Persson delivered, there is a very interesting case study on the UK and Brexit, shows that austerity also helped, the success of populist parties. So if you like, economics, short run and more medium term, tend to have an effect. Now, there seems to be some weak evidence that perhaps automation in production have also contributed a role. The issue about immigration and refugees is, the evidence, at least my reading, is that it's much more mixed for a very simple reason. You mentioned the statistics for Brexit. Brexit, London, one could argue that a considerable fraction of the population voted for Brexit, but the majority of people residing in London did not vote. And most refugees most immigrants would flock to London. So overall, populist parties have been actually doing super well in the countryside, while most immigrants will tend to move in the big cities. So there are some mixed results and some studies there. I don't think we know quite well what's happening here. I think one reason why it's very hard to measure cultural aspects, especially the ones related to immigration, has to do with some very interesting work that my friend Alberto Lezin and Stephanie Stancheva have documented, which regards to the very big gap between perceptions and reality. So I strongly urge you to have a look at this work, and my understanding is that Ernst is working on something related, because when Stephanie and Alberto and their team ask people, what do you think is the share of immigrants in the US population? And among immigrants, what do you believe is the share of Muslim immigrants, for example? What you tend to observe is that huge differences of perceptions versus reality. Typically in economics, when we do apply the research, we will download the true data, and we'll try to see whether there are some interesting associations. We'll try to control for things and think about exogenous variation. But as economists, we're not so good at thinking about different perceptions. I know that David Yanagazava has a very cool research agenda here, which I urge you to have a look. But it's a very interesting aspect which relates to the role of media and what has been accused as fake news, because it's a very hard issue to try to measure the effect of immigration, let's say, on the voting share of populist parties, if you believe something very, very different about the share of immigrations than the ones in reality. And I think this is something that clearly we need, at least from my profession, more research. So I just want to add this caveat. I did a lot of macroeconomics in my youth, and macroeconomists tend to predict many things. I just want to add a caveat that it's very hard to predict, especially about the future. And I just want to finish with some questions which I think are actually very interesting, which are like food for thought. I don't have any answers. Given the significant increase in inequality, perhaps coming from trade globalization, from automation, from other features, what I think is stunning is that most of the populist movement has a right-wing underlying background. I know that I come from a country where it was like a mostly left-wing party, but this is something very, very interesting. Now, the second is how we can think about identity politics. You gave some ideas, but I think it's something that we don't fully understand at this stage. And what I see as the biggest dangers of the recent populist movement vis-à-vis other similar movements post-World War II is that nowadays there is not so much an attack on specific policies as it used to be in the past, perhaps about the role of unions, let's say, in the economy, or about the role of banks in the economy, but it is an attack more generally on free market liberal institutions. So many populist movements, attack the justice system, which we consider as a pillar of the way we conduct business and we structure our social affairs. And secondly, there seems to be an attack on the social contract that characterized modern democracies and capitalist systems. And I think this is, again, something that economists now start thinking about it, but it's something that we need to think much more as a society. Let me thank you again for your kind invitation.